Hello, everyone. LaRonda Little here.
And I am Emmanuel Lati.
Welcome to another episode of Be Well, Be Whole, where we discuss life, spirituality, and wellness. We invite you to follow and engage us on Instagram and Facebook at Per Ank Wellness.
Here we go.
Good evening, and welcome to another conversation at Be Well, Be Whole. I'm LaRonda, and I have with me my co-host, Dr. Larte, and today we have with us Reverends Anjie and Andy Woodworth, who co-pastor Neighborhood Church in Atlanta, Georgia. So we are together this evening today talking about some very troubling things in our communities some things that are happening in our community surrounding our young people and police violence. Several weeks ago, no sooner than we received the verdict from the Chauvin case, we learned that Daunte Wright has been killed by a police officer who alleged that she mistook her gun for a taser. Then news broke that Adam Toledo, 13 years old, was fatally shot by police in Chicago. And then Micaiah Bryant, who was 16 years old, she was shot by police in Columbus, Ohio. So what do we say to our children? This is the question that we don't have any answers. We have thoughts as parents and grandparents, for sure.
Yeah, so, children dying at the hands of police, mothers and relatives scrambling to find ways of holding words and other ways of holding us together. And the community being in such turmoil, with people having different perspectives on this, so you can listen to a range of different views, very, very different views about these, and so the question, what do we say to our children? How do we even help them and us to actually navigate this troubling situation? I think that's really what we are wanting to, and that's what we're talking about this evening.
So Anjie and Andy, tell us a little bit about yourselves.
Yeah, so we are co-pastors and co-parents and spouses, and we have 3 children who are now 9, 10, and just turned 12.
Solidly into the preteen phase.
That's right.
Yes.
That's real. New change
Yeah.
in life. And we pastor a church that is, we are a family that strives to be anti-racist and in our lives and our core values, but so does our church. And our church has all ages. It's very multi-generational and increasingly multiracial and very diverse in a lot of other ways as well. And so I think we really think about this question both as parents and as pastors, maybe in slightly different ways, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
In addition to our children, I'm just thinking also about like the children of our congregation, and particularly we're trying to congeal a youth ministry that is very very diverse in a lot of ways, and how those conversations emerge as a part of our reality in this moment.
And a lot of our congregation, our congregation is very intersectional too, and in that we also are very LGBTQIA inclusive, affirming, rooted, which is a really intersectional place of beauty, but also of increased violence risk.
Yeah.
So you're talking about the violence of Black and brown bodies, or against Black and brown bodies in the world, in this case about police violence. And then you talk about queer folks or same gender loving folks or trans folks, and how that also amplifies that. And so some of our kids are queer identifying as well. Some of them have same-sex parents. And so I think that just even amplifies the conversation even a little
kind of
more.
Multiracial families with same-sex parents. So it's like all the intersections and layers, you know, it's an interesting place to be. Yeah.
And how they encounter the world.
Yeah.
Right? That's
Right.
a lot for them.
I would imagine, given the ethos of your community, that probably better than most churches, you all are able to hold these different conversations and hold these these tensions together. What are some of the specific anti-racist work that you do in your congregation?
I mean, I hope we do hold some of those tensions, right? I mean, like you said, there are very few solid answers and lots of attempts. I think for us, a lot of times it is, I mean, it's maybe an overused phrase right now, but a lot of the anti-racism work, at least we start with, is holding space for everybody to bring the fullness of who they are and their experiences to the table, literally to the communion table, to the liturgy, to worship, into the space. And the pain and the grief and the burdens of the day, but also the joys of the day. And I think that's something that's been the ways that is inhabited differently in white bodies and in Black bodies and in queer bodies is really a beautiful thing. But we've all learned a lot about that, particularly as the violence has increased.
Okay.
Or at least our awareness of it.
Right. Yeah. Well, that's right. And the ways that white folks can kind of skate through some of these weeks and brush it off and ignore the news in a different way, right? And then you're worshiping with your siblings in Christ and trying to hold space, and suddenly white folks have to check their privilege, right, to hold space for the pain and the just the heaviness sometimes,
as well as the geographical location of our congregation. As you know, we are located physically in what is now a predominantly white neighborhood and relatively affluent.
Exclusively affluent.
Yeah. But historically was not always that way, and also is located very closely to other neighborhoods of varying other locations, right? And so when we kind of said we're going to be a neighborhood church, we're going to mistake that claim both theologically and geographically. That has led us to kind of wrestle with, like, okay, so we would love to be a congregation that is as multicultural, multi-ethnic, all the things as Atlanta, but we look around and the immediate proximity is not thus. And so how do we begin to enter into conversations and build relationships and conversation partners and organizational partners, frankly, that help us build relationships that bring about some kind of restoration in our community.
And that started with an attempt to be like, well, if we're going to be majority white, like, we're going to be the best gosh darn white people we can figure out how to be in the name of Jesus, right? Which led us immediately to more intensive anti-racism work. But then that's also led to all these amazing community partners and to listening and learning and collaborative, we call it collaborative Christian discipleship and partnership, which is really makes for lovely community, right? And a lot of possibilities for entering into life together.
You have 9, 10, and 12, 9, 11, and 12.
9, 10, and 12.
Yeah.
9 and 12.
Yeah.
So have they had, well, I myself, I have 2 sons, and they are 14 and 16.
Bless you.
Yes, thank you. I need all of that. And more money to feed them.
Yes.
But, have your children what kind of conversations have you all had? I was about to say had to have.
Mm.
I don't know if that is the case for you. I know it's the case from where I sit. But what are some of the conversations that you all have had around the dinner table, or what kind of questions have your young people asked?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that's part of what we're really aware of too, is that we could avoid those conversations, and many of our white peers do. But that's part of the work, right? Is to not avoid those conversations, because if we want them to be allies or and co-conspirators or just anti-racist at the bare minimum, they need to know the conversations their friends are having to have for their own safety, right? And all of our kids do have like friends of all kinds of races, which is great. And so that also makes it easier. We don't live in a white bubble intentionally. We've worked really hard to not live in a white bubble. And we've worked very hard really on every category of any kind of anything you could talk to kids about. Our attitude has always been, both at home and at church, to answer whatever questions come up truthfully, straightforward, at an age appropriate level.
Yeah.
And so that's like some changes, obviously, but we don't want to ever teach things that we have to unteach later, or that someone else will need to unteach later.
That's kind of an old school Christian educator, like children's ministry mantra, is don't teach them anything you'll have to unteach them or they'll have to unlearn later. And that seems like a really core thing for anti-racism for white folks, because that's where we all get stuck later, is when we have to like peel back the onion and realize the world wasn't what everyone told us it was. But if we never had to learn those lies of white supremacy, right, we wouldn't have to be learning these things now, right? So we try to not teach our kids the lies of white supremacy.
Yeah. And it's interesting, like I've recently, I would say it's certainly, we're home a lot more than we used to be. Yes,
absolutely.
And so we're doing the dishes and cooking dinner and in the kitchen and listening to the radio. And so the current events are a part of our family conversation. And they have honed in on that in a way in the last year that, they were getting older and old enough to understand sort of what's happening in the world. But we want an awareness of the world to be a part of who they are as people.
And I think there's kind of a couple particular ways that plays out. One, our oldest, like you said, she's a preteen, she's in 6th grade, and just a year younger than Adam Toledo, right? Like, she's his age, basically. And so she's able to process in a more nuanced way, but our younger ones are still coming out, just starting to come out of that really concrete, like right and wrong thinking, black and white about everything, right? And so our youngest has really struggled to, because he is clear when things are wrong in the world and unjust. But then he's like, well, the police are all bad.
Okay.
Which puts us in a strange position, right? We also know many police officers, have police officers in our congregation, detectives really, but who are lovely, actually Black male police officers, right? And many of the police officers in our immediate zone are actually really well trained, really have seemed to be doing really good work, right?
Okay.
But we don't want to be people who say not all police, right? Like, it's the strange conversation to say, okay, but you can't also just go, and we say this about all kinds of things, political realities, all kinds of things. You can't just go around saying something's all wrong. You have to say why. You can't just dismiss it with one statement. If you're going to make those statements in the world, let's talk about why you think that is. Because yes, our policing system is rooted in, from its very beginnings, in racism. And then many, many different ways that has leveled up over the years, right? And the individuals rooting their lives in racism and racist instinctive reactions, right? And how do you start to dissect that with a kid is a lot, but it's very different because we can dissect it
from a distance. I'm recognizing that we can pop our heads out the door and go to the park that's across the street, and walk around our neighborhoods and these kind of tree-lined streets of Atlanta, and we live in comfort and we live in privilege, and it becomes in some ways an exercise in teaching nuance. Like, you see this but what you see is not all that is, or is not even how most people live their life every day.
But it's not a safety warning conversation, right?
Yeah.
It's a very different conversation.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead, Dr. Larte.
It's what we're talking about really kind of strikes some very, very interesting parallels for me in terms of the church that I have served, which is a largely African immigrant church, and the largest constituency in the church is we have up to 60 children and youth. You know, I mean, they are the largest single constituency actually in the church, and so they are navigating this thing of being foreign, but being also American, growing up in the schools, and all of that kind of thing, with parents who, many of whom were not born here, came here, and are anxious to inculcate in their children some values from home. And so there's that kind of thing, and it also means that they occupy a kind of curious, different position from African American, and so some of the conversations that we're having navigate those interstices, between all of these being but not being, perceived in particular ways and responded to in different ways. So the conversation about police and about how to behave, and so that kind of conversation all have to have. But then there are some interesting things, and it also causes me to think of I have a grandson who is 12. And then a granddaughter who is she's 8 going 30.
Yes.
And she's and she is really, really, really savvy, in terms of the kinds of things that she raises and asks about, and some of the things that you've been saying, Anjie and Andy. They kind of navigating this developmentally different and challenging thing. So I think that it's very, very important to listen to them, have them say to us what they are thinking, how they are experiencing it, and then seek to walk alongside them. I think that is, I think we often, I often misjudge them in terms of I don't always attribute this kind of perceptiveness that they actually have to them, and so I think it's very, very important to hear them and walk alongside them,
and the way that they need to process things later. I mean there's moments of immediacy, and they hear a thing and then immediately, why did this happen? Help me understand this. But then there's the way that it settles in, right? And so they kind of come alongside you, a couple days later sometimes, and say like, well, I saw this, I heard this, my friend told me about this. And how do you help them process it later when it's become something that they're really wrestling with? That's the real tender part of it, right? Is sitting with your kids, realizing the world is not easy. Yeah.
Right. I was, we just put Lance, my 16-year-old, behind the wheel.
Yeah.
And the feelings of, sitting in the passenger side, and I'm watching him on the driver's side, and my heart breaks a little every time I look at him, because I see his anxiety in negotiating just the stuff on the road and the things in the car.
Yeah.
So, and it's such a precarious situation. So in my mind, I'm thinking, what will happen the day I'm not in this car and he's alone and he's working through his anxieties as he's driving and he gets pulled over? Will the lessons, the conversations come back to him? What will he remember? This is my anxiety. So today we were talking on the way home, and he mentioned when we first started driving, he said, and our routine is I will pick him up from track practice and I'll get on the other side and he'll get in. So he said one day, he said, I knew you were going to ask me to drive, and a chill went through my body. And that shook me, for him to just to be, but I was also pleased that he was able to articulate that.
Yes.
That a chill went through me, but I realized that you were going to be in the car with me, so I was okay. And so then he says, and I said, well, how do you think it's going to be once you start driving by yourself? And he said, well, I've been thinking about different scenarios. So he's already been playing out what to do. How would he respond? He's already been playing these things out. At first I was surprised, but then I was like, well, why not? He's watching the same news as me and his dad. So it makes sense. And he was so in telling me, he was pretty resolute in his statements, which was both reassuring and really sad.
And I think that's one thing that we have to talk about with kids, because particularly littler kids, right? They know the world shouldn't be that way, that there shouldn't be a difference in how people are treated. And so we want to try to invest in that vision of the world with them and also hold the reality, but that's not the way it is right now. And how do we protect people? And I think as white parents raising white kids, one of the conversations we have is how can you behave in a way that protects your friends and doesn't put your friend at risk. So right now, what that looks like is a conversation about Nerf guns, that as much as we are anti-gun, period, one of our kids is hardcore into Nerf guns, which are relatively harmless in the scheme of things, right?
I mean, irritating. Yes.
But one of his Black friends can't play with them. It's not even in our backyard, not even because his mom's like real clear that's a bad thing to get into. They're not going to have, and so we have had that conversation about you don't want to be the one to put your friend at risk because the world shouldn't treat you differently, but they might. And then we'll have those same conversations about riding in cars and what that means if you're with Black friends and how it shouldn't be that way, but they will likely be treated differently, which it's horrific to have to parent so differently. You shouldn't have to have those conversations differently. And of course, we try to hold that space with our congregations too, but we haven't had to live that the same way. So we can't do it quite the same, right? Like it's not the same, but that's an important piece of, I think, at least the anti-racist touch for white folks is how can we even teach our white kids to put their bodies between their Black friends and police officers, right? Like, is that your role? If there's a stop, like, what does that look like for you, right? And then to help them think through those scenarios, just like your son's doing, right?
Yeah. I'm these conversations they are so anxiety producing. Like you say, Angie, we have to talk to our children in this way. Even when I was a child, we didn't have these conversations. And it's not that these things weren't happening. They were, but social media and media in general just puts it all out in the open. And we have to face it with some degree of humility and grace, and some degree of I don't know, intellect and nuance, all of these things. So I have pastors and bishops in this conversation. I have to ask the question, how do we as a church, and we begin to touch on this a little bit, how do we as a church address some of these issues? What does the church have to say?
I think one of the things that comes into my mind is, and we sort of touched on this, but the way that church becomes a space for hearing and holding all of these experiences. We say regularly in our services, all of who you are is welcome here. All of who you are is loved by God. And what I've come to recognize is that people are coming to be able to feel a sense of openness and embrace in our congregation. And so the sense we hear more stories than we did before, right? Or in other contexts, I think. And so what does it mean to be able to listen to those stories and say, yes, this is a real and valid experience. I know that there are many ways people, A, can't share what's really happening for them, and B, may not know how to process it. I'm not sure I know how to process it, but I can hear and I can listen and I can mirror and I can name how valid that experience is, in a way that in the pastoral role, I'm trying to model my good learning from Dr. Larte from many years ago, but really kind of in the way that God does hold who we are. We can do that for each other in many settings. And there's other moments in worship where we can name those things. I mean, it's one thing to listen, it's another thing to speak, right? And to say we acknowledge this. And
the church can get involved in the dismantling. I mean,
yes.
Not just racism, right? But police systems, get involved in training. And I think this
fixing policy. I mean, very real policy in communities.
And our, judicial system and our prison system, we have a huge push right now working in our congregation with the abolishing prison, educating in prison, literacy in prisons, all that thing, but with the ultimate goal of abolishing prison because it's not beneficial to our society, right?
And I think I love that you said that, Anjie, that you began to define what abolishing means. Entails, because these are the pieces of the conversation that are largely left out, and, in extreme cases. But it's very important to name, this is what we mean by when we say abolish. Here is how that comes about.
And I particularly think that there's so much that a different perspective of white church and of church in general has to say in the world, to politics and to criminal justice and all these things, that there is a place for white pastors and white lay people who have power to show up and use it. You can get an appointment with the DA. You can get an appointment, particularly we're talking small towns, right? The deacon of the Baptist church can make an appointment with the chief of police because they probably sit in the pews together, right? That's where we can show up and have these conversations that are in our congregation, right? There are folks who need to heal and need some healing space. And then the rest of us who aren't so beaten down by that injustice and literal violence can take to the streets a little bit, right?
Yeah.
And quite frankly, you tapped on something that's key for me. If you belong to a church that allows city officials to come in and talk to the congregation when it's election time, they owe us and arguments. And I think we need to cultivate that relationship even the more. If they sit in our pews, then we need to, there's a mandate. And I think it's somewhere in the Bible, in Amos, I think, that we need to be having these conversations for sure.
Absolutely. And, I mean, one thing that I would really, I think that the conversation about guns and the conversation about gun violence contextually in the United States of America, the church needs to take that conversation head on and challenge the very easy, kind of meshing of guns and faith, because I think that is a particularly USA church issue. So if there's anything that I would want to say, to the church of which I'm a part in the United States of America, it is, we all need to be having deep and serious theological conversations about the whole gun issue in the United States of America.
Absolutely.
Yes, indeed. Well, friends, that time just flew by.
Yeah.
Wow.
So yeah, I have a quote here, but before I read this, do you all have any final thoughts that you would like to share with us?
I just want to say thank you. We are just trying to figure things out like everybody else.
Yeah.
But we learned so much from both of you and from so many other people. And there's so many wise voices in the world. They're willingly sharing what they have to offer. And I would encourage all folks to just listen wherever they can.
Yeah. We follow a ministry model that we learned from the Missional Wisdom Foundation, but it's from other places as well. That's involves 4 steps of showing up, paying attention, cooperating with God, and releasing the outcome. So the showing up and the paying attention and the cooperating and releasing are important to us, and that's really taught us many things. And this experience today is teaching me things too. So
thanks for letting us show up and cooperate with you.
Well, thank you very much. It's such a delight, hearing, and also, just seeing how you are navigating this space in church in terms of, the community that you're working in and building and all of that. And then the family that you are raising. This is all very, very, very encouraging, enlightening, challenging, and I think that's it. If there's a thing to that I'd like to say, it is that being pastoral includes being challenging. And I think that the deepest care we can have for each other is to not let us off the hook.
Amen. Yeah.
So whether it's children or whoever, we ought to hold each other to the best that we can be.
Yeah.
In being children of a God who is the best. So yeah, thank you.
So I will read a quote from Between the World and Me by Ta-Nehisi Coates. And I will be reading from page 146. And he says, "We are captured, brother, surrounded by the majoritarian bandits of America. And this has happened here in our only home, and the terrible truth is that we cannot will ourselves to an escape on our own. Perhaps that is the hope of the movement, to awaken the dreamers, to rouse them to the facts of what their need to be white, to talk like they are white, to think that they are white, which is to think that they are beyond the design flaws of humanity has done to the world. But you cannot arrange your life around them and the small chance of the dreamers coming into consciousness. Our moment is too brief. Our bodies are too precious. And you are here now, and you must live. And there is so much out there to live for, not just in someone else's country, but in your own home. So, thank y'all for joining us in this conversation, and peace and blessings to all of you. And until next time, be well, be whole.
Be whole.